Literature-loving friends, gather close. Tonight, I'd like to open the door to Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo Story, 1991, a film that wears the shape of a life like a coat that has been torn, patched, and finally pressed for Sunday service. The first time I watched it, I expected a straight line, a parade of incidents moving from childhood to public office. But what I found instead was a pattern of ruptures, a father's shadow that darkens rather than shelters, a son drawn toward a centrifugal pull of power and street-level loyalty, a sudden plunge into brutality of accusation and prison, and a slow, stubborn rediscovery of self that looks less like triumph and more like the painstaking work of replacing one cracked tile a day. Time. If you've ever wondered how a person's name can become a battleground, a surname carrying the thunder of an entire province, a nickname that echoes through alleyways and chapels, this biopic turns that curiosity into cinema. It doesn't beg for sympathy. It asks for attention, for patience, for the willingness to watch a man's armor melt away until we can see the frightened, furious, hopeful person underneath. And somewhere along this path, the film nudges us toward a question no courtroom can resolve. When is a life redeemed, and who gets to decide? I want to tell you first about the texture of the world here, because the world is the real protagonist. The camera leads us through districts where politics doesn't live in manifestos, but in favors, handshakes, and the calculus of who can call whom at midnight. Posters peel on sunburnt walls. Megaphones bar promises. Jeepneys cough and glitter. Street vendors hold the city together with skewers and coins. In that air, a boy inherits expectations he did not draft. His father's name is both wind at his back and weight on his shoulders. The film sketches that duality with a quiet confidence. We see glimpses of privilege, open doors, smiling fixers, schoolmasters who look at the surname before the grades, and we see the iron price of belonging to a clan that is always on stage. To be born into a political story is to grow up inside a theater where the audience never leaves. That's the crucible in which the young man begins to harden. But brashness is cheap in a country where brashness is the currency of young men. The film's early movement doesn't romanticize the swagger. It lets us feel why the swagger arrives. There's the ache to live up to a legend, the itch to be seen, the gravitational field of Barcata, those friends who feel like brothers until the police lights flash. There's also a mother's steady hand and a community's complicated gaze, a mixture of admiration and suspicion, reserved for surnames that can build roads and break them. This is where filmmakers are wise. They do not pretend our protagonist is a saint in waiting. He is a son shaped by a house where both love and pressure live, a street that rewards toughness, and a calendar that keeps feeding him days he cannot manage without some armor. Armor cracks from the inside first. The inciting trouble arrives with the violence of official language, allegations that read like a verdict, headlines that feel like handcuffs, the whispered network turning into a chorus. Suddenly he is a defendant, and suddenly the myth of the family name, that useful passport, is not enough to pass through. The film is careful with the courtroom and the cell. It keeps us close to the panic fluttering just behind a stern face. You'll notice the sound design doing delicate work here. The way the world seemed to fall quiet in one scene and roar in the next, as if the city itself were deciding whether to devour him or spit him out. In prison, masculinity is a language and a currency, but it's also a mirror. The film lingers on that mirror. The man who walked in with his jaw set now sees the cost of always being the hardest person in the room. There are no campaign rallies here, only routines. Steel doors, ration lines, sweat, and the low hum of men who memorize a map of their own regrets. If you've ever listened to a testimony given not at a pulpit but at a bedside, low voice, no theatrics, a man telling the truth because there's no tactic left, you'll recognize the pivot that the film builds toward. It is not instantaneous. It does not ask us to buy a miracle. It shows us an accumulation of small surrenders, a guarded conversation with a fellow inmate who knows scripture by heart, a letter that takes 3 drafts to become honest, a moment when the protagonist stops rehearsing defense and starts describing a wound. There's a scene with light falling through bars that could have been cliché, but the director lets it breathe, a silence long enough to feel like a choice. Is redemption a thunderclap or a rhythm? The film votes for rhythm. One day at a time, one neighbor reconciled, one habit broken, one apology practiced until the tongue can finally carry it without shaking. Outside the prison, life does not pause and then restart. It keeps moving without you. That truth lands like a blow when the gates open. The city has rearranged itself. New names on posters, new alliances brokered in coffee shops he doesn't yet know. The film does not pretend that freedom is a triumphal parade. It shows us the awkwardness of reentry, the old friends who cannot decide whether to salute or distance themselves, the journalists waiting for a soundbite that can be filed under contrite, the family home that looks the same but is not. And then, almost shyly, the narrative allows itself a kind of grace, the slow rebuilding of a man's vocation. Maybe he was born into politics, yes, but the film suggests that vocation can be reclaimed and redefined. Service without swagger, leadership that remembers the price of arrogance, public work that tries to be less about dynasty and more about duty. If that sounds naive, the movie's answer is to show the bruises. Reform does not erase enemies. A cleaner heart does not guarantee cleaner outcomes. But the attempt is the point. For me, the spine of this biopic is not the question, did he do it, or who framed whom, though those threads give a narrative with procedural momentum. The spine is spiritual and social at once. What does it cost a man to take the heat of his family's history and convert it into warmth instead of flame? The screenplay understands something essential about countries like ours, where power is intimate. In such places, absolution is never solely personal. It is negotiated in neighborhoods, in district offices, in churchyards after Sunday service, in the murmurs of tricycle drivers and market stall owners. The film anchors its emotional beats in precisely those places. We witness the courage it takes to visit a street where your name once caused fear and to greet it with an open hand. We witness the practical dignity of small, consistent acts, helping sort out a local permit without demanding fealty, showing up at wakes and weddings without a photographer, sitting longer with constituents than protocol allows. If cinema can persuade, this is its persuasion, not spectacle, but accumulation. I know some of you will approach this story with skepticism, and rightly so. Biopics can tip into hagiography, sanding down edges, turning complicated men into tidy parables. But the film's saving grace is its attention to consequence. The people around protagonists are not props. The mother has a spine of her own. Her mercy includes boundaries. The friends who cheer the early bravado also carry the memory of nights that ended badly, and the script lets them say so. Even the antagonists are given a logic. They operate within a moral mathematics we may not like, but we recognize. This is not villainy for sport. It is governance's knife fight, and some of them believe the knife is necessary. Stylistically, the movie belongs to a moment in Filipino cinema, when true crime, political scandal, and redemption arcs were braided together for a public that knew these worlds too well. You can feel the error in the staging, the smoky interiors, the procedural montages, the heated press conferences, the core use of gossip as an actual narrative device. There's a certain muscularity to the direction. Set pieces that hum with crowd energy, confrontations that prefer clenched jaws to caramelized speeches, and yet the film keeps returning to smallness. A bench under a withered tree, a hand hovering, and then finally resting on a friend's shoulder. A prayer whispered not to impress, but to ask for the strength to do tomorrow what was promised today. I think that's why it endures for viewers like us who care about the way stories hold up under moral weight. It does not resolve everything, offers a life mid-repair. In terms of structure, the opening act seeds 3 lines that will braid and tighten as we move forward. First, the family legacy, the claim it lays on identity and the debt it imposes. Second, the public arena, how the mechanics of influence can both scaffold and sabotage a young man's path. Third, the interior turn, the conversion of a personality from force to service, which is the hardest conversion of all. Watch closely for how the film sets up objects as ethical anchors, a ring that feels heavy for reasons beyond gold, a photo in a living room that supervises conversations, a Bible with dog-eared pages that move from prop to guide. None of these are shoved in our faces. They accumulate, like evidence and like grace. What makes the story persuasive is not that it claims a halo for its subject, but that it allows fallibility to stand without excuses. When a man loses his temper, we see both the provocation and the choice. When he stumbles into self-pity, the camera does not flinch. And when he chooses better, refuses a shortcut, declines revenge, tells the truth even when it weakens his case, the film refuses syrup. It keeps the light flat, the room ordinary. Virtue, it suggests, is not cinematic because it is glamorous. It is cinematic because it is rare and difficult, and because an entire city can feel its tremor when it happens. I want, too, to honor the audiences who first received this film. For them, the names and districts were not fables. They were maps to real griefs and loyalties. Watching it now, we step into that earlier room and inherit its tensions. The movie trusts us to navigate with empathy and suspicion in equal measure. That's the sweet spot for criticism, as well as citizenship. We don't have to agree about every detail of the case to agree that prisons are the most expensive way a society admits has failed earlier. We don't have to share the same theology to recognize the strange, generative power confession when it is lived and not merely performed. The film stakes its claim there, on the bet that ordinary decency can be rehabilitated in a person who expected to survive by hardness alone. So let me set the table for what follows in our journey. In the next part, we'll walk the first half of the narrative beat by beat. The family home is a training ground for both pride and tenderness, the wildfire of accusation, the machineries of a trial that seems pre-scored, the brutal etiquette of incarceration, and the fragile beginnings of an inward change that the world around him is not yet ready to trust. We'll keep our eyes on how the screenplay balances public noise with private reckoning, and we'll listen for the quiet motifs, the borrowed shirt, the silence after flare-up, the way a man learns to lower his voice in order to be truly heard. Then, as the story crests, we'll test the arc it offers. Not the fairy tale of instant vindication, but the harder, slower choreography of amends. Stay with me, friends. The path this film takes is not easy, but it is honest, and I suspect will leave us with harder questions and a better kind of hope. Literature-loving friends, let's walk carefully into the first half of this story, because here the film does something more intricate than a simple chronology. It begins with a boy watching the world to frame a family. through a father whose reputation is both a crown and a chain. From the earliest sequences, we see a household where legacy is spoken of not as possibility, but as destiny. You can almost feel the weight of it in the way relatives talk about duty, in the way visitors address the boy not by his given name, but by the name that precedes him, the family name that acts like a banner above his head. There's tenderness in that house, too, a mother whose eyes linger longer than her words, but tenderness is often outshouted by expectation. What does it mean to grow up being told that your choices are already half-written? That tension threads itself into the film's earliest moments, giving the audience an uneasy sense that childhood itself is on loan. As he grows into adolescence and young adulthood, the world outside the family home beckons with its own set of promises. The streets, with their crackle of jeepney horns, their smell of roasted peanuts, their neon-lit billiard halls and corners where barcada laughter drowns out the warnings of elders, become another classroom, one where reputation is currency. Here the young Vincent learns the choreography of swagger, how to stand, how to deflect insults, how to claim space in conversations and on sidewalks. The film portrays these scenes not as cartoonish bravado, but as the shaping of armor piece by piece. It's a life that feeds on adrenaline, where fights are less about fists than about visibility, and where loyalty is tested in small, combustible moments. The filmmakers are careful to show that every act of bravado earns both admiration and resentment, and that dual reaction will later prove fatal. The pivot into politics comes almost as a natural extension of these early postures. When the family name already opens doors, when elders are already whispering that the son must carry the torch, it's not a question of if, but when. Campaign scenes arrive not as opportunities, but as obligations. The film shows him climbing onto makeshift stages, addressing crowds that look at him as though they're really looking at his lineage, not at him. It's a theater in which he sometimes relishes the spotlight, but also one that makes him uneasy, because he knows that the applause is not entirely his. Still, ambition has a way of tightening its grip, and soon he's embroiled in the machinery of politics, rallies, promises, alliances sealed with handshakes in smoke-filled rooms. It is here that the first shadows of corruption creep in, not always through direct guilt, but through the ambiguity of being near power when power begins to rot. The film then pushes us into the crucible, the allegations. They come suddenly, though the script has seeded the possibility from the beginning. A night that begins like any other ends with headlines, arrests, and the slow horror of realizing that reputation is not bulletproof. The courtroom sequences have an electricity of their own. We watch Vincent sit behind his lawyers, jaw tight, eyes flickering between defiance and fear. The camera lingers on the gavel, on the slow nods of judges, on the shifting gazes of the public gallery, an entire province watching the fall of a name. This is where the audience feels the gravity of dynasty. When the pedestal collapses, the crash echoes louder. Prison life becomes a crucible within a crucible. Gone are the chauffeured rides and respectful nods. Here, men measure each other by strength, by cunning, by sheer endurance. The movie doesn't shy away from brutality, moments of violence in dim-lit barracks, the constant tension of survival, but it balances those with quiet interludes. A prisoner humming a hymn, an old Bible passed from bunk to bunk, the sound of rain falling on tin roofs like a sermon in code. Vincent learns that here, there is no audience to impress, only time to survive. In one scene, his face is caught between shadows and slivers of light, a cinematic metaphor for the interior battle already underway. What keeps the first half of the narrative taut is the way it balances spectacle with intimacy. The public downfall is loud, megaphone, reporters, shouting matches, but the personal unraveling is quiet, almost whispered. By the midpoint, we understand that the real trial is not only about whether the allegations stick, but about whether man can strip off the armor that has both protected and poisoned him. The audience is left on a knife's edge. Will he double down on pride and bitterness, or will the cracks in his defenses allow something unexpected to seep through? That's where the film leaves us at intermission, inside a prison cell, with a man who has lost his bearings but still clings to the possibility that the story is not over. It's a pause that feels less like a comma and more like a cliff. The life he has known has collapsed, and yet the faintest silhouette of redemption has begun to shimmer, almost imperceptibly, in the distance. Literature-loving friends, let us now immerse ourselves in the second half of the story, because it is here that the film reshapes itself in the heat of downfall into the slower, quieter rhythm of renewal. If the first half was all noise, crowds, campaigns, accusations, and prison gates clanging shut, the second half hums with the undertones of silence, a reflection of tentative beginnings. And yet, this quieter register never loses its urgency. It is urgent because a man's identity is at stake, and with the trust of a family, a community, and a country that never forgets a scandal. To follow the second half is to walk with Vincent Crisologo as he struggles not only against hostile circumstances, but against the pull of his own past, a past that clings like smoke to clothes, never quite willing to dissipate. The story resumes in the belly of prison life, but something has shifted. The violence of initiation, the posturing, the testing, the subtle and overt challenges from other inmates has cooled into a different kind of ordeal, endurance. This is the stage of incarceration where the days blend, where a man discovers whether his spirit can withstand repetition, monotony, and the constant awareness of lost time. The film shows this in visual motifs. Endless sequences of gates opening and shutting, the sound of heavy boots in corridors, tin plates clattering with the same meals, rain dripping from a crack in a roof. For the protagonist, the punishment is no longer the novelty of confinement, but the realization that the world outside is moving on without him. He receives letters, glimpses of headlines, and occasional visits that remind him that politics, like life, abhors a vacuum. Other names are rising. Other families are claiming the spotlight. The question becomes not only whether he can survive prison, but whether there will be anything left to return to. It is here that the story introduces the subtle turn of the soul. We see him wrestling with his own anger, at his accusers, at the system, at fate itself. At first, the anger is raw, expressed in clenched fists and short bursts of violence. But then, gradually, the anger softens into exhaustion, and exhaustion opens a doorway to reflection. One of the most powerful sequences involves an older inmate, weathered and almost monk-like, who shares scripture with him. This figure is not sanctimonious, but quietly persuasive, embodying the paradox of someone who has been broken and yet holds a strange authority. Through their conversations, the film lets us hear the first whispers of repentance. Not the cheap kind, not the rehearsed courtroom statements, but the difficult, halting admissions of failure and pain. The protagonist begins to read, to listen, to sit in silence. For the first time in his life, he seems less interested in being heard than in hearing. The transformation is not instant. The movie is wise enough to avoid the cliché of the overnight saint. Instead, we see him relapse into bitterness, snapping at fellow prisoners, refusing to attend chapel services, mocking the very words that later begin to heal him. Redemption here is portrayed as a process, like a wound that must be reopened before it can heal properly. The film lingers on these reversals, as if to remind the audience that growth is not a straight line. And yet, through the cracks, light begins to filter. We witness him writing letters. Not manifestos, not political declarations, but personal apologies, some of which he tears up before sending, as though the act of writing itself were more important than the delivery. We see him sit in the corner of the cell, Bible open, lips moving silently. We see him offer to mediate a dispute between fellow inmates, surprising even himself with his patience. Slowly, the armor he wore for so long, armor of pride, swagger, defiance, begins to fall away. The film places great emphasis on family visits. These are not sentimental interludes, but crucibles of their own. His mother's presence carries both love and disappointment. She is tender but firm, unwilling to indulge self-pity. There's a scene where she tells him, with devastating simplicity, that his name is not only his, it belongs to her, to his father, to the community. To redeem himself is not only a private matter. It is a matter of honoring everyone who carries the weight of that name. The look on his face, a mix of shame and resolution, tells us that he has heard her. These moments of family confrontation are as important as any sermon, for they ground the transformation not in abstract piety, but in concrete obligation. Eventually, the narrative shifts toward the possibility of freedom. Rumors of parole, whispers of political intervention, and appeals from sympathetic voices begin to circulate. But the film resists the temptation to make freedom a climax. Instead, it emphasizes that the true freedom has already begun inside the cell. By the time the gates do open, the man walking out is not the same one who walked in. He is slower, more deliberate, less intoxicated by applause. The outside world greets him with curiosity and suspicion. Reporters shove microphones in his face, hungry for contrition or defiance. Old allies reappear, some eager to reclaim him, others wary of his new humility. The tension here is palpable. Will he relapse into old patterns, or will he live out the transformation that seemed to take root behind bars? The film portrays his re-entry into public life with remarkable restraint. There are no triumphant rallies, no sweeping declarations. Instead, we see small acts of service, visiting constituents without entourage, speaking softly where once he would have shouted, declining opportunities for vengeance. These choices confuse people around him. Some interpret them as weakness, others as strategy. But the audience, having witnessed the prison transformation, understands that they are something else entirely, a decision to live differently, even when it costs. We watch him repair relationships, extend apologies, and engage in community work that lacks the glamour of politics but carries the weight of sincerity. The question of faith becomes central here. The film frames a conversion not as a private mystical experience, but as a lived ethic. We see him pray not in grand public spectacles, but in small, quiet moments. We see him refuse to exploit his faith for political gain, even when advisors encourage him to. The filmmakers seem intent on showing that true belief, if it is to matter at all, must shape the mundane. How one speaks, how one forgives, how one spends the hours when no cameras are watching. This is perhaps the most radical claim of the second half. That redemption is not cinematic because it is dramatic, but because it is ordinary and persistent. Of course, the shadows of the past never disappear completely. The film acknowledges that the accusations continue to haunt him, that not everyone is convinced of his innocence or transformation. There are moments when old rivals taunt him, when former allies question his motives, when the media dredges up past scandals. These reminders are crucial because they prevent the narrative from slipping into hagiography. They remind us that a man's past cannot be erased. It can only be carried differently. The tension between reputation and reality, between public memory and private renewal, is never fully resolved. And that is the point. The closing movements of the film bring us back to community. We see him participating in outreach programs, speaking not with fiery rhetoric but with humility. We see the faces of people who once feared his name now softening into cautious trust. In one poignant scene, he stands in a church, not at the pulpit but among the pews, singing quietly with others. The camera lingers on his face, not triumphant but peaceful, as if to say that true redemption is not about being above others but being among them. The final impression is not a man who is conquered, but of a man who has been conquered by grace, by humility, by the realization that a name is not a crown but responsibility. What makes the second half so powerful is its refusal to offer easy closure. The film does not end with a neat resolution, a happily ever after. Instead, it ends with a sense of ongoingness, a man still walking, still learning, still making amends. The narrative suggests that redemption is not a destination, but a daily practice, a rhythm of choices that must be renewed with each sunrise. That, perhaps, is the most honest conclusion a biopic can offer. In reflecting on this second half, I find myself struck by the courage of its restraint. Many films in this genre would have chosen melodrama, turning conversion into spectacle and freedom into a parade. But here, the filmmakers trusted the quiet power of persistence. They trusted that audiences would recognize the true drama in the slow rebuilding of a man's soul. And they were right, because what lingers after credits is not the memory of grand speeches or courtroom theatrics, but the image of a man sitting quietly, finally at peace with himself, finally ready to serve without demanding worship. That is the story's legacy. Not that Vincent Crisologo became a saint, but that he became human in a deeper, more honest way. And in telling his story, the film dares to suggest that we, too, might find room in our lives for transformation, not in the blaze of spectacle, but in the rhythm of ordinary faithfulness. This, my literature-loving friends, is how the second half unfolds, a journey from prison walls to the open air, from anger to humility, from name as weapon to name as vocation. It is long, slow, difficult, and because of that, it is believable. It is a reminder that in cinema, as in life, the most extraordinary stories are often those that end not with fireworks, but with the steady glow of a lamp lit in the dark. Literature-loving friends, let us press further into this review and turn our gaze toward the characters, for without them the film will be no more than a set of events. In the second half of our exploration, we move from the external plot into the internal architecture of people, their desires, their wounds, the way they shift and reveal themselves. A biopic like Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo story, is built on the challenge of rendering not just history, but humanity. The central figure may carry the weight of the title, but the supporting characters, family, rivals, mentors, communities, are the mirrors against which he becomes visible. To understand this film, we must walk into their skin and feel the way they press upon the protagonist, sometimes as burdens, sometimes as bombs, sometimes as both at once. Let us begin with Vincent Crisologo himself, the gravitational center of a narrative. His character is not a straight line. It is a jagged graph of rises and plunges, arrogance and shame, violence and contrition. The film gives us a man who begins in shadow, the shadow of his father's political name, the shadow of expectations, the shadow of streets where toughness is the only reliable armor. He is first portrayed as restless, a young man unwilling to be ordinary, determined to carve his own mark. This restlessness is both admirable and dangerous. It gives him charisma, the ability to stand before a crowd and make them believe, but it also blinds him, convincing him that his surname can protect him from consequence, that boldness is a substitute for wisdom. The genius of the film is its refusal to flatten him into either villain or victim. He is both fragile and ferocious, both culpable and capable of change. By the time prison strips away his defenses, we see not a fall from greatness, but a slow confrontation with self, an internal reckoning that makes him a more complex figure than any courtroom verdict could capture. Yet, Vincent does not exist in a vacuum. His mother is one of the film's quiet anchors. She is not given the glamour of long monologues, but her presence radiates through the story. From early scenes of childhood tenderness to later confrontations in visiting rooms, she embodies the paradox of maternal love, forgiving yet firm, wounded yet unwavering. She becomes a voice of conscience when he has none, reminding him that a name belongs not only to an individual but to a family, a community, a legacy. The film treats her not as a background figure, but as a moral compass. In her silences, in her weary eyes, we read the pain of a woman who loves a son fiercely but refuses to excuse him. This balance is what makes her so compelling. She is neither sentimentalized nor demonized. She is human, caught between love and disappointment, yet resolute in her hope that he can be more. The father's presence, though less direct, looms just as heavily. His reputation, his achievements, his failures, these form a landscape against which Vincent struggles. We see him in flashbacks, in anecdotes, in the way others speak his name with reverence or disdain. The father is not only a parent but a standard, an impossible yardstick that both elevates and crushes the son. Even when absent, he dictates the contours of Vincent's choices. The son is driven by both loyalty and defiance. Loyalty to uphold the family name, defiance against the suffocating expectation to mirror it. The filmmakers understand that this father-son dynamic is not about dialogue, but about inheritance. The tragedy and hope of Vincent's life is that he cannot escape his father's shadow, but he can choose how to inhabit it. Then there are the rivals and antagonists, the figures who represent the machinery of accusation, political competition, and public judgment. These characters are not painted in caricature. Instead, they are given enough texture to reveal that their opposition is not born merely of malice, but of the ruthless calculations of politics. Some are opportunists, seizing on his downfall to advance their own interests. Others are convinced of his guilt and pursue him with a sense of justice. Together, they form the crucible that tests him. Their presence ensures that the film does not descend into self-pity. The obstacles they present are real, their logic convincing, their victories painful. They remind us that the world outside of prison does not pause to await a man's redemption. It moves forward, often with indifference or hostility. Among the most striking supporting figures are the fellow inmates. Here the prison becomes less a backdrop and more a stage for miniature dramas. Each prisoner embodies a different attitude towards suffering: cynicism, resignation, aggression, faith. Through them, Vincent encounters mirrors of possible futures. One inmate, hardened and bitter, shows him what he might become if he surrenders to rage. Another, serene and faith-filled, offers a glimpse of what endurance might look like if coupled with grace. These characters are sketched with economy, but their impact on the protagonist is profound. They are catalysts, each pushing him closer to a choice he must make about the man he wants to become. We cannot overlook the community, the nameless collective that watches, judges, whispers. The film portrays the crowd as a character in its own right. At rallies, they cheer his bravado. In court, they murmur about his downfall. In the streets, they debate his guilt over cigarettes and street food. They embody the fickleness of public perception, the way society both exalts and crucifies its figures. The brilliance here is that the community is not simply backdrop. It is conscience and chorus, echoing the contradictions of society that craves both strong men and saints, that punishes excess yet secretly admires it. Vincent's relationship with this collective audience is fraught. He feeds on their approval, but also fears their judgment. In the second half of the film, his return to this community becomes the ultimate test of his transformation. Faith itself is personified through certain characters: pastors, fellow believers, mentors who introduce him to a language of repentance and grace. These figures risk being portrayed as clichés, but the film avoids this by grounding them in authenticity. They do not arrive as miracle workers. They are flawed, ordinary people who discover resilience in belief. Their role is not to rescue Vincent, but to challenge him, to invite him into a new rhythm of living. They are the ones who remind him that redemption is not proven by declarations, but by daily acts. Through them, the film anchors spirituality not in theatrics, but in the grit of ordinary persistence. Even the journalists, often peripheral in such narratives, are given significance. Their questions, their flashbulbs, their relentless pursuit of sound bites symbolize the pressure of public accountability. They are not villains, but they are relentless. They stand as representatives of society that demands explanations, but rarely grants forgiveness. Each time a microphone is thrust into Vincent's face, we feel the tension between his desire to defend himself and his newfound commitment to humility. The journalists, then, are less characters and symbols of the ongoing trial that continues outside the courtroom. What emerges from this tapestry of characters is a web of relationships that shape the protagonist's journey. He is not redeemed in isolation. He is redeemed in relation to others: family, rivals, fellow prisoners, community, mentors. Each interaction is a thread pulling him toward or away from renewal. The film insists that identity is never solitary. It is always communal, always entangled in the lives of others. By the end of this character study, we see that the true drama of Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo story, lies not in the events themselves, but in the people who populate them. It is in the mother's unwavering gaze, the father's haunting shadow, the rival's sneer, the inmate's hymn, the community's whisper, the journalist's flash. These are the forces that batter and refine the protagonist, that strip him of arrogance and clothe him in humility. To watch the film with attention to character is to realize that redemption is never abstract. It is always relational, always embodied in the faces of others. And so, literature-loving friends, as we step back from this character analysis, we carry with us a deeper understanding of why the story matters. It is not merely the tale of one man's fall and rise. It is a tale of how people, family, foes, fellow sufferers, become the crucibles of transformation. Without them, there is no story. With them, the narrative becomes not only believable but profoundly human. Literature-loving friends, let us now move into the strangest facts, those hidden details and textured oddities that coil themselves around a biopic like Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo Story, 1991, and give it its peculiar fragrance. Every life story, when transposed to the screen, carries its own eccentricities, sometimes in the way real events are adapted, sometimes in the methods of performance, sometimes in the cultural echoes that ripple beneath the film's surface. To peel back those layers is to realize that this film is not simply a straight telling of events, but a mosaic assembled from choices, coincidences, and cultural quirks that make it unlike any other entry in Filipino cinema of its time. The strangeness here is not grotesque or sensational. It is the kind of strangeness that makes you pause, tilt your head, and say, only in this story, only in this place, only with these people could this have unfolded as it did. One of the strangest facts, if we begin with the real-life Vincent Crisologo, is how his story was always entangled with biblical language long before it was adapted for film. His dramatic prison conversion made him, in the eyes of many Filipinos, less a politician and more a parable. The strangeness lies in how a man once whispered about an association with violence and scandal could become known as a lay preacher whose testimony was shared in churches across the archipelago. For an audience in 1991, watching a story unfold on screen meant straddling the uncanny line between sinner and saint, a line Filipinos understand well because their culture is so steeped in Catholic imagery of fall and redemption. That duality gave the movie a quality that was stranger than fiction. Here was a political scion turned convict, then convict turned evangelist, portrayed with dramatic vigor in a medium that thrives on extremes. Stranger still is how the film stages politics itself. In Western cinema, political dynasties are often framed with grandeur, mahogany offices, sweeping speeches, dramatic campaigns. In Bingbong, politics is shown through more earthy textures. Dusty barangay halls, makeshift campaign stages decorated with crepe paper, jeepneys plastered with posters. This grounds the story in an authentically Filipino register, but also highlights the strangeness of power's proximity to poverty. Audiences in 1991 would have recognized those campaign trails. They looked like their own neighborhoods. And yet, the same neighborhoods could also become crucibles of violence, suspicion, and betrayal. The strangeness is not only cinematic. It is sociological, the recognition that the same streets that cheered a candidate could just as easily gossip about his downfall. Another odd detail lies in the way the prison sequences were handled. Filipino cinema of the era often rendered prisons as chaotic, nearly theatrical spaces of gang rivalries and brawls. Bingbong certainly includes such elements, but also lingers on small, almost tender details. A prisoner braiding strips of old cloth into rosaries, a Bible passed hand to hand until its pages begin to fray, the sound of men singing hymns in unison like a choir of cracked voices. These touches might seem minor, but they are striking for their insistence on finding humanity in the bleakest environment. The strangeness here is tonal. A prison film that refuses to stay only in a register of brutality, instead insisting on a weird blend of menace and devotion, as though violence and faith had set up rival pulpits inside the same walls. There is also something uncanny in the way Vincent's transformation is depicted. Most redemption arcs in film are punctuated by a grand epiphany, a single moment of revelation. Here, the strangeness lies in its mundanity. His change comes through repetition, through the act of reading scripture every night, through the stubborn decision to apologize, through the tedious rhythm of patience. To show this on screen was, in its own way, daring, because cinema often struggles to dramatize persistence. Yet the film manages it by leaning on subtle cues, long silences, pauses, a change in posture, the simple act of lowering his voice. It is strange precisely because it resists theatricality, choosing instead to anchor the most dramatic turn of his life in ordinary gestures. Then there is the cultural strangeness of how audiences receive the film. For some, it was inspiration. For others, suspicion. The idea that a politician could be genuinely reformed seemed improbable in a country where dynasties had long cultivated both power and impunity. And yet, because Vincent's testimony was so visible in church circles, many viewers were willing to extend belief. The strangeness was that the same audience who distrusted politicians in general could still cheer for one man's redemption when framed as a spiritual miracle. That paradox, cynicism and faith coexisting, became part of the film's legacy. Even stranger is the way the film blends genres. It is, on its surface, a political biopic, yet it contains elements of crime drama, courtroom thriller, prison survival tale, and religious testimony film. To watch it is to feel as though one is watching several different movies woven together. The rise and fall saga of a dynasty's son, the gritty spectacle of accusation and imprisonment, the intimate chamber piece of a man's slow moral awakening, and finally the almost evangelical narrative of conversion. Most films would collapse under the weight of so many shifts, but Bingbong leans into the strangeness, trusting its audience to follow. That genre hybridity is not an accident. It mirrors the reality of Filipino life, where politics, crime, faith, and family are never neatly separated but always tangled together. There is also a peculiar irony in the casting. The actor chosen to play Vincent carried his own aura of toughness and vulnerability, a face capable of menace and contrition in equal measure. In a strange way, his performance became its own form of testimony, convincing not because of melodrama, but because of the way his eyes carried both defiance and shame. Viewers who knew Vincent personally found themselves caught between recognizing the man and believing the performance. That eerie overlap between real-life figure and screen portrayal added another layer of strangeness. Where did history end and cinema begin? The soundtrack contributes to this aura as well. Instead of relying solely on triumphant or mournful orchestration, the film uses local textures, hymns sung by choirs, folk instruments underpinning dramatic moments, even snippets of campaign jingles that recur as ironic refrains. To hear a once celebratory tune resurface during a courtroom scene is to feel the sting of irony, how quickly glory turns to scandal. This use of music is strange because it weaponizes familiarity. The audience is made to hear their own streets, their own churches, their own elections reflected back with unsettling poignancy. And finally, perhaps the strangest fact is that the story does not resolve into certainty. By the end, the film resists providing a final verdict. Was he innocent of the charges? Was his redemption entirely sincere or partly strategic? Was his later service enough to outweigh his earlier failures? The film refuses to tell us. Instead, it leaves the audience in the same position as the community, to decide for themselves how to remember him. That refusal of neatness is itself strange in a genre that usually prefers closure. Here, ambiguity is a legacy, and is both unsettling and honest. These, then, are the strangest facts that haunt the film. Not only the peculiarities of Vincent Crisologo's life, but the cultural oddities of how his story was told and received. A politician turned prisoner turned preacher, a dynasty son reimagined as a testimony, a film that is part crime drama, part spiritual confession, part political cautionary tale. It is strange because it is true, and true because it is strange. And so, literature-loving friends, as we step away from these oddities, we begin to understand that the strangeness is not decoration, it is essence. To tell a life honestly is always to court strangeness, because real lives do not follow the neat arts of fiction. In Vincent Crisologo Story, the peculiar and the profound are intertwined, leaving us with a film that unsettles as much as it inspires. Literature-loving friends, let us lean now into the critical perspectives and the wider movie events that surrounded Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo Story, 1991, because no film truly lives on its own. It emerges into an ecosystem of cinema, of politics, of culture, and of audience memory. This is the step where we test the work under the harder light, not simply recounting what it showed, but examining how it was received, debated, and framed within the film culture of its time. To do this properly, we have to stand in multiple rooms at once. The room of 1990s Philippine cinema, the room of international genre patterns, the room of critics writing with both suspicion and sympathy, and the room of audiences whose reactions told their own truths. What makes this step long and layered is precisely the interplay of those rooms. They echo against each other until the film is less a single text than a cultural conversation. Begin first with the Philippine film landscape of 1991. This was a period when biopics were an established, almost ritual genre. Filipino audiences were accustomed to seeing the lives of politicians, celebrities, and criminals rendered in melodramatic arcs. These films were often commercially driven, aiming to attract viewers with names they already knew, scandal they already discussed in markets and jeepneys, and redemptive or tragic arcs that played into cultural expectations. Within this environment, the Vincent Crisologo biopic was not an oddity but part of a recognizable current. Yet what critics noted even at the time was its unusual balance. It leaned heavily on the structure of scandal and prison drama, but it dared to devote equal energy to redemption. For some, that choice made the film feel too soft, almost propagandistic. For others, it gave a sincerity that elevated above exploitive fare. Critical responses often split along predictable lines. Political commentators and journalists, wary of the very idea of dynastic figures being rehabilitated through cinema, were skeptical. They worried that the film blurred the line between biography and hagiography, that it asked audiences to forgive too quickly, that it acted less as cinema and more as image management. Some reviews carried the sharp edge of cynicism. A politician's sins cannot be absolved by camera angles, one wrote, dismissing the film as an exercise in reputation repair. Others criticized its pacing, claiming that the courtroom and prison sections dragged, that the weight of repetition slowed down the dramatic energy. Yet within those criticisms there was also an acknowledgement. The film's refusal to glamorize scandal too heavily was itself a break from genre convention. Instead of dwelling on violence or political spectacle, it kept circling back to quiet moments of self-reckoning. To certain critics, this was either admirable honesty or uncinematic dullness, depending on their vantage. Among church communities and Christian publications, however, the reception tilted strongly positive. They saw in the movie a parable of transformation that resonated with their own language of testimony. Pastors and lay leaders often cited Vincent's story as evidence of God's capacity to redeem even the most notorious. For them, the film was not mere cinema but visual sermon, something that could be shown in church events, youth fellowships, or Bible studies as both warning and inspiration. This reception gave the film a second life beyond theaters, in private screenings and church gatherings where its box office performance mattered less than its testimonial function. This dual reception, cynical from secular critics, celebratory from faith communities, was one of the strangest and most telling movie events of its time. It is also worth situating the film internationally. The early 1990s were rife with redemption arc dramas across global cinema. In Hollywood, audiences were watching stories of gangsters, boxers, and addicts finding some form of renewal. In Hong Kong, crime thrillers often ended with sudden, almost operatic gestures of sacrifice or redemption. Against this backdrop, the Filipino biopic of Vincent Crisologo shared DNA but also diverged. Where international films often heighten redemption through climactic set pieces, Bingbong slowed into mundane ritual. Bible reading, small apologies, hesitant acts of service. International critics who encountered the film at festivals or in retrospectives later often remarked on this difference. It felt less like a thriller with a moral and more like a testimony framed through cinema. That was both its weakness and its power. From the perspective of Filipino film historians, the movie also occupies a peculiar place in the trajectory of political biopics. Earlier decades had produced films that glorified wartime heroes, nationalist figures, or revolutionary martyrs. The 1980s, shaped by the turbulence of Marcos' fall and the People Power movement, had already complicated the picture. Audiences were weary of propaganda and suspicious of glorification. By 1991, then, a film about a political scion who falls, suffers, and then seeks redemption was tapping into an ambivalent mood. Audiences were hungry for stories of accountability, but also open to stories of transformation. The critics who viewed the film as overly sympathetic may have underestimated just how ready audiences were to see a politician portrayed with vulnerability instead of sheer power. That readiness explains why the film found resonance even as a divided critical opinion. The performances were another focal point of critical commentary. Reviewers praised the lead actor's ability to convey both menace and humility, a duality necessary to make the art believable. Some noted that his body language shifted dramatically, from swaggering confidence in the early rallies to hunched stillness in prison, to measured calm in later community scenes. This embodied transformation made the story more persuasive than any dialogue could. Supporting performances, particularly the mother, were also praised for grounding the story in emotional realism. Yet critics did not ignore weaknesses. Certain courtroom sequences felt too procedural. Some melodramatic flourishes, like extended monologues, risked theatricality, and the musical score occasionally tipped into sentimentality. Still, even dissenting reviews admitted the central performance gave the film its spine. One of the most important movie events tied to the film was the way it sparked debate in media and academic circles about the role of cinema in shaping public memory. Could a biopic rehabilitate someone's image regardless of fact? Was cinema complicit in rewriting history, or was it simply one more medium through which contested narratives were aired? Some cultural critics argued that the very act of putting Vincent's story on screen was political, that it gave him visibility, sympathy, and a platform others never received. Others countered that silencing such stories was equally dangerous, that audiences had the right to wrestle with complexity rather than be shielded from it. In hindsight, the film can be seen as part of a larger Filipino conversation about representation, image, and the tension between cinema and politics. Box office performance added another layer to its story. While not a record-breaking hit, it drew steady audiences, particularly in northern Luzon, where Crisologo's name carried weight. It also found viewers in Manila, where curiosity about political scandal remained high. Importantly, the film's life extended beyond its theatrical run, thanks to VHS distribution and church screenings. In some communities, it became less a movie night, and more morality tales screened in small halls, accompanied by discussions or testimonies. This was a rare afterlife for a biopic, proof that its impact lay not only in commercial numbers, but in the way it circulated within faith networks. From a vantage point of later critics revisiting 1990 cinema, the movie is often read as emblematic of its time. Earnest, melodramatic, uneven, yet shot through with sincerity. It lacks the polish of international cinema, but its power lies in its unpolished honesty. Some modern reviewers argue that its rawness actually makes it more truthful than slicker productions. Others find it dated, weighed down by its heavy moralism. Yet even in dissent, they acknowledge its cultural importance. For better or worse, it captured a moment when cinema, politics, and faith collided on screen in a uniquely Filipino key. The strangest and perhaps most enduring critical perspective, however, is that the film itself is unfinished, not in craft but in implication. Because Vincent Crisologo's life continued long after 1991, viewers could never watch the film as a closed text. His later political and spiritual work kept reopening the story, forcing audiences to reevaluate the sincerity of the redemption they saw on screen. In this sense, every rewatch was haunted by new knowledge. What he did later, what controversies resurfaced, what legacies lingered. Few films carry this perpetual unfinishedness. It is both a burden and a strange kind of vitality. And so, my friends, when we talk about Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo story from a critical perspective, we are not only reviewing a film, we are reviewing an entanglement of cinema with culture, politics, and faith. The critics who dismissed it as soft propaganda, the church leaders who embraced it as testimony, the audiences who debated it in marketplaces and pews. All of these responses are part of its story. It is not merely a film but an event, a moment when the screen became a mirror for a nation's conflicting instincts. Cynicism and hope, suspicion and faith, anger and forgiveness. That is why the film endures, not because it is flawless, but because it is a cultural conversation that never truly ended. Literature-loving friends, let us now sink into production insights and fun facts that shaped Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo Story, 1991. Because while the narrative itself holds us with an emotional arc, the making of a film often tells us just as much about a culture as the story it portrays. To peer behind the camera is to discover how choices of casting, direction, editing, and even on-set coincidences became part of the DNA of the finished work. These details are not gossip but texture, reminders that cinema is always a negotiation between art, logistics, and the stubborn unpredictability of life. Begin with the choice to make the film at all. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Philippine film industry was in a fervent phase of biopics and docudramas. Producers understood that audiences flocked to names they recognized, especially when those names were linked to scandal. Yet the Crisologo story was riskier than most. On one hand, his prison years and subsequent conversion made for a narrative arc with built-in drama. On the other, the danger of being accused of propaganda was high. Some production insiders later admitted that the project moved forward only after Vincent himself gave reluctant approval, not because he wanted glorification, but because he believed his testimony might prevent others from repeating his mistakes. This blessing gave the film a peculiar authenticity. It was dramatization, yes, but dramatization born of consent rather than purely external speculation. Casting was another fascinating process. The lead actor was chosen for his ability to project both charisma and vulnerability. He had a reputation for portraying tough, volatile characters, but he also carried a certain weariness in his eyes that made him believable as a man humbled by prison. According to interviews, he spent time studying Vincent's mannerisms, speech patterns, and even his silences. The strangest preparation detail was that he reportedly visited the very prison where Vincent had been held, walking through the cells and speaking with guards and former inmates to understand the atmosphere. He later described it as one of the most unsettling experiences of his career, claiming he could hear the walls breathe with regret. Whether or not one takes this literally, the anecdote captures the eerie weight of inhabiting a living person's trauma. The mother's role was cast with equal care. Producers knew that this character would be the emotional spine of the film, and so they selected an actress known not only for her dramatic chops, but for her maternal aura. On set, she often slipped into maternal behavior even when cameras weren't rolling, scolding the younger actors or offering snacks during breaks. Crew members joked that she carried the set the same way her character carried the family, quietly but firmly. The warmth of her off-camera presence may explain why her on-screen performance radiates such authenticity. The production schedule itself was grueling. Shot largely on location in northern Luzon and Manila, the crew often had to navigate political sensitivities. Some locations resisted filming because of lingering bitterness about the real-life scandals. Others welcomed the cameras eagerly, seeing the project as a chance to rehabilitate the region's image. The result was a mosaic of cooperation and tension. In one town, extras reportedly refused to cheer during a rally scene because they still associated the name Crisologo with pain. The director adjusted by asking them to act with neutrality, which ironically gave the scene a more authentic, uneasy energy. What might have been a disruption turned into a production gift. The prison scenes carried their own challenges. With limited budgets, the crew repurposed an abandoned municipal facility, dressing it with authentic props donated by correctional officers. To create the oppressive atmosphere, cinematographers deliberately avoided glossy lighting, instead using harsh fluorescence and natural shadows. This choice gave the prison sequences a raw, almost documentary feel, a contrast to more polished campaign scenes earlier in the film. Fun fact, some of the extras in the prison sequences were former inmates who had actually served time with Vincent. Their presence lent an uncanny realism. They didn't need direction on how to walk, eat, or posture. They simply inhabited the space as they once had. Another quirky production detail involved the courtroom sequences. The gavel used in filming was borrowed from an actual regional trial court, on the condition that it be returned before the next working day. The prop master reportedly sprinted back and forth between shoots to ensure compliance, terrified of losing government property. Small details like this remind us how much cinema is cobbled together not from massive budgets, but from improvisations and borrowed objects. The soundtrack had its own eccentric journey. The composer originally envisioned a lush orchestral score, but budget limitations forced him to work with a smaller ensemble. To fill the gaps, he integrated local instruments, kalintang gongs, bamboo flutes, even street sounds recorded on site. One fun fact is that the campaign chant heard early in the film was an improvised melody created by the sound crew, inspired by actual slogans they overheard from neighborhood rallies during production. This chant was then reused ironically in later sequences, giving the score an almost ghostly echo of lost confidence. There were moments of tension between director and producers as well. Producers pushed for more sensational depictions of scandal, more explicit violence, more melodramatic courtroom shouting. The director resisted, arguing that the power of the story lay in restraint. At one point, a heated argument nearly halted production, but the director's vision eventually prevailed. Critics later noted that this restraint gave the film its sincerity, even if it caused some commercial appeal. Ironically, what producers saw as weakness became the film's enduring strength. One delightful fun fact involved a rain scene. The script called for Vincent to sit in a cell as rain poured through a broken roof, symbolizing his inner desolation. But on the day of shooting, the weather was brutally dry. The crew, unable to afford rain machines, borrowed water trucks from the local fire department. The makeshift storm was so convincing that nearby residents thought a pipe had burst and rushed to help, only to stumble into a movie set. The authenticity of the rain sound, the heavy splash on tin and concrete, became one of the film's most memorable auditory motifs. Editing provided another layer of intrigue. The first cut reportedly ran over 3 hours, sprawling with courtroom minutiae and extended testimonies. Test audiences found it exhausting. The editor, under pressure, carved the film down to just over 2 hours, focusing on emotional beats rather than procedural detail. Ironically, some critics later accused the film of oversimplifying the trial, not realizing that the original cut had been far denser. Lost in the editing room were whole sequences of legal strategy that might have slowed the pacing, but enriched the detail. Cinephiles who unearthed fragments of these cuts years later argued that the film we know is both incomplete and sharper for its incompleteness. The premiere itself was an event worth noting. Held in Quezon City, it attracted a curious mix of audiences. Political allies and rivals of the Crisologo family, church leaders, film critics, and ordinary viewers lured by the promise of scandal. The atmosphere was electric, with some attendees openly weeping during the redemption sequences, while others rolled their eyes. Reports say that applause erupted not only at the credits, but also during certain key scenes, particularly when Vincent's character first humbles himself in prison. This spontaneous reaction underscored how much the story tapped into Filipino hunger for transformation, even when skepticism lingered. And finally, perhaps the most fascinating fun fact, the film unintentionally created a kind of mythic afterlife for the real Vincent Crisologo. For years after its release, people referred to scenes from the movie as though they were direct historical memory. Church groups repeated dialogues as if they were actual quotes. Political opponents mocked the movie version of events, and supporters defended it as testimony. In effect, the film became part of the historical record, not because it was strictly accurate, but because it became the lens through which many Filipinos remembered the story. That is a peculiar power of cinema. It doesn't just reflect history. It rewrites how people carry it. So, literature-loving friends, as we step back from these production insights and fun facts, we realize that the making of Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo story, was itself a story of improvisation, conflict, accident, and cultural resonance. Rain from fire trucks, gavels borrowed from courts, extras who were once inmates, actors haunted by research trips. All of these details bleed into the final film, giving it a texture that no amount of scripting could have achieved. To know these behind-the-scenes truths is to see the film not just as narrative, but as artifact, a living record of how cinema, history, and community entangle in the messy, miraculous act of storytelling. Literature-loving friends, let us wander now into the setting and cinematic elements of Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo Story, 1991, because a film of this weight does not simply tell its story with dialogue and performance. It breathes it into being through spaces, textures, colors, and the way the camera persuades us to feel. If the earlier steps walked us through plot and character, here we must pay attention to how the world itself is staged. The locations that press upon the protagonist, the cinematography that tells us when to hold our breath, the soundscape that fills silence with meaning. In a film about power, scandal, and redemption, the settings are never neutral. They are instruments that shape perception, mirrors that reflect the inner life of the man at its center. The first setting we encounter, and perhaps the most crucial, is a family home. Not a mansion gleaming with untouchable wealth, but a space where legacy is visible in photographs, trophies, portraits of forebears hung too high on walls. The home is warm in its furnishings, wooden furniture, religious icons, a mother's gentle hand arranging curtains, but heavy in its atmosphere. This heaviness comes not from decor, but from history. Every wall seems to whisper expectation. You are not only yourself, you are your father's son, your clan's heir, your community symbol. The cinematography emphasizes this by often framing Vincent in doorways or beneath portraits, visually reminding us that he cannot move without being watched by eyes past and present. In moments of tenderness, the home glows with soft lighting, but in moment of conflict, shadows lengthen, turning the same living room into a stage for unspoken judgment. Step outside, and we meet the street settings of his youth. Here, the palette changes. Jeepney is painted in a riot of colors, neon flickering from billiard halls, the chatter of barcada filling alleys with sound. These streets are alive, kinetic, pulsing with vitality, but they are also arenas of posturing. The film treats them as both playground and battlefield. In wide shots, we see groups of young men strutting, laughing, claiming space. In close-ups, we see the flash of eyes, the clench of fists, the unspoken hierarchy of toughness. The soundscape layers laughter with the distant honk of traffic, the hiss of street food cooking, the stray bark of dogs. Together, these elements create an atmosphere that is intoxicating for a young man craving identity and respect. The streets give him an audience before he ever stands on a political stage. Then come the campaign settings. These are markedly different from Western political films that show grand halls and formal debates. Here, politics unfolds in basketball courts repurposed into rally venues, barangay plazas crowded with plastic chairs, and makeshift stages draped with banners. The camera often shoots from below, making the speaker loom large, yet the surroundings remind us of fragility. Crepe paper banners fluttering, stage boards creaking, children weaving between legs. The cinematography captures both the grandeur and precariousness of local politics, the way charisma can electrify a crowd in one moment and evaporate in the next. One striking detail is how the sound of applause is often undercut by murmurs, by side conversations, by skepticism that refuses to be silenced. The setting itself becomes a metaphor. Power here is visible but unstable, always one accusation away from collapse. The courtroom is another central stage, and its cinematic treatment is deliberate. Instead of emphasizing scale, the film narrows its gaze. Close-ups of hands fidgeting, pens scratching, eyes darting across the room. The space is suffocating, not because it is small, but because the air feels thick with judgment. Light streams through slatted windows, cutting the room into stripes of illumination and shadow, as if to remind us that truth itself is divided. The acoustics amplify every cough, every shuffle, every bang of the gavel. The effect is not theatrical grandeur, but oppressive scrutiny. In this setting, Vincent appears diminished. The same man who filled stages with his voice now sits hunched, his power stripped away by the architecture of justice. Then comes the prison, the most dominant setting of the film's middle arc. The production's choice to shoot in an abandoned municipal facility lends authenticity. Peeling paint, rusted bars, concrete that seems to sweat under humidity. Cinematically, the prison is rendered through contrasts. Wide shots emphasize overcrowding. Rows of men in cramped spaces, bunks stacked like cages. But the most affecting moments are in close-up. The scrape of tin plates, the sweat dripping down a temple, the flicker of a candle during prayer. The lighting is harsh, fluorescent, casting sickly greens and grays, yet the director occasionally allows natural light to intrude, streaming through barred windows and slants that resemble grace breaking into desolation. The sound design layers metallic echoes with human murmurs, until the prison itself feels like a living organism, breathing, growling, whispering. It is not merely a backdrop, but a crucible, shaping every choice Vincent makes within its walls. Religious spaces, by contrast, are bathed in different light, whether it is a chapel inside the prison, or a church outside its walls. The cinematography softens here. Candles flicker warmly, hymns echo faintly, and the camera lingers longer on faces at prayer. These settings serve as counterpoints to the harshness of prison, places where silence is not threatening but healing, where light does not interrogate but consoles. The film makes heavy use of symmetry in these spaces, rows of pews, lines of candles, shafts of light falling perfectly through stained glass, as if to suggest that here, in these moments, a chaotic life finds some order. When Vincent is released, the settings shift once more. The outside world is not welcoming. It is altered. Streets he once claimed as a stage now feel foreign. The cinematography reflects this by subtly changing perspective. Angles are slightly higher, as though the world now looks down upon him, or slightly wider, emphasizing his smallness in spaces he once dominated. Campaign stages, once filled with roaring crowds, now appear with fewer faces, more skeptical gazes. Homes that once vibrated with expectation now echo with uncertainty. In these settings, he is not triumphant but tentative, a man relearning how to walk in familiar landscapes that no longer feel like his. Sound plays a critical role throughout. The film's auditory palette oscillates between noise and silence. Crowds roar, prison corridors clang, courtroom murmurs buzz. But at key moments, the soundtrack cuts into quiet, a letter being written, a prayer whispered, a tear falling. These are amplified precisely because everything else is muted. Music, too, is used sparingly but powerfully. Folk instruments and hymns thread through the score, anchoring the story in Filipino cultural resonance. Campaign chants recur ironically, once celebratory, later mournful. Hymns sung by prisoners become motifs of endurance. The final act features less music and more ambient sound, suggesting that redemption is not about spectacle, but about hearing the world plainly again. Cinematography deserves its own reflection. The director uses framing to chart Vincent's inner transformation. Early on, he is shot in wide frames, surrounded by barcada, family, or crowds, emphasizes his dependence on visibility and approval. In prison, frames tighten. We see his face behind bars, his body hemmed in by walls, his gestures constrained. As redemption begins, the camera gradually widens again, but this time with a difference. He is often shown alone in these wide shots, a visual signal that his identity no longer depends on the crowd but on his own interiority. The arc of the framing mirrors the arc of man, from outer approval to inner renewal. Color is another subtle but vital element. The first act glows with warm hues, streetlights, campaign banners, family interiors. The prison act sinks into cold greens and grays, a palette of despair. The final act strikes a balance. Muted tones, earthy browns, soft golds. It is as though the film's color scheme itself undergoes conversion, from brightness through shadow to tempered light. The shift is gradual enough that audiences feel it emotionally before they notice it visually. All these elements combine to give the film a setting that is both specific and symbolic. The home, the street, the campaign stage, the courtroom, the prison, the church, the re-entered community. Each is not just a place, but a chapter in a man's transformation. Cinematic elements, framing, color, sound, light, do not merely decorate these settings. They interpret them, guiding the audience to feel not only what happens, but what it means. And so, my literature-loving friends, as we step away from this analysis of setting and cinematic elements, we see more clearly how the film's power comes not only from its story, but from its textures. The clang of prison gates, the flutter of campaign banners, the stripe of sunlight across a courtroom bench, the soft glow of a candle in chapel darkness. These are not incidental. They are the language through which the story speaks. The grammar of cinema translating biography into experience. In Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo story, the world itself becomes a character, shaping, testing, and finally offering space for redemption. Literature-loving friends, let us now move behind the curtain into the realm of production insights and behind-the-scenes revelations. Because while the film we watch is a polished narrative about rise, downfall, and redemption, the story of how Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo Story, 1991, was made contains its own hidden drama. Films of this type, political biopics made in an industry wrestling with censorship, budgetary limitations, and the hunger for authenticity, are never merely scripted into being. They are fought for, argued over, improvised, and occasionally rescued by sheer luck. To know these details is to understand how the film breathes, why it looks and feels the way it does, and why it continues to resonate despite its age. The first behind-the-scenes challenge was simply convincing financiers to back the project. By the early 1990s, the Filipino film market was dominated by melodramas, action flicks, and star-driven romances. Producers were wary of biopics unless the subject was universally adored or comfortably dead. Vincent Crisologo's story was neither safe nor settled. He was alive, visible, still carrying both notoriety and sympathy in equal measure. This meant that any film about him risked accusations of propaganda or exploitation. The production team moved forward only after ensuring that Crisologo himself would allow his life story to be dramatized, though accounts differ on whether he was directly involved in approving scenes. This cautious blessing gave the project both legitimacy and controversy. Casting remained one of the most contentious aspects. The actor chosen to portray Vincent had a reputation for toughness, a cinematic aura of machismo, but also carried the capacity to reveal cracks in that toughness. Producers wanted someone audiences could fear in early scenes and forgive in later ones. The selection process reportedly involved heated debates, with some backing more glamorous stars who could guarantee box office appeal. The director, however, insisted on an actor capable of weight rather than glamour, someone who could carry long silences without losing audience attention. This insistence proved crucial. Critics later noted that the performance's restrained shifts, from swagger to vulnerability, anchored the entire film. Recreating settings posed practical hurdles. The production could not always film in the actual districts associated with the Crisologo name due to lingering political sensitivities. Some local leaders welcomed the cameras, seeing the film as a chance to showcase their towns. Others flatly refused, worried about reopening old wounds. As a result, certain campaign rallies were staged in substitute towns, dressed with banners and extras to mimic the political climate of Ilocos. The art department took painstaking care to replicate local political aesthetics, hand-painted banners, bamboo scaffolding from makeshift stages, and the exact red and white palette common to 1970s and 80s rallies. Even the font of campaign slogans were researched to match the era, down to their slightly uneven brushstrokes. The prison sequences were perhaps the most difficult to achieve. With limited resources, the crew transformed an abandoned municipal facility into a convincing penitentiary. Yet to capture the claustrophobic authenticity of overcrowded jails, they also recruited extras who had once been inmates themselves. These men brought a rough familiarity to the set. They knew how to sit, how to stare, how to shuffle during roll call. Some crew members later admitted that directing them was easier than directing trained extras, because they simply remembered how to be prisoners. This infusion of lived experience gave the prison scenes their grit, an authenticity that audiences remarked upon. Lighting design became a crucial storytelling tool. The cinematographer used harsh fluorescence to emphasize despair inside prison walls, casting sickly greens and grays across Vincent's face. Natural light, by contrast, was saved for moments of introspection and hope. One scene where beams of sunlight slant through barred windows was almost ruined when the weather turned cloudy. Desperate, the crew waited hours until the sun broke through, filming the scene in a frantic burst before the light faded again. That single captured moment became one of the most haunting visuals of the film, a reminder that cinema often depends on patience and providence as much as planning. Sound design carried its own stories. With budget limitation preventing a lush orchestral score, the composer leaned heavily on local instruments and field recordings. The clang of steel doors, the echo of footsteps in corridors, the hum of prisoners singing hymns, all were captured live on set and woven into the soundtrack. A peculiar detail. One of them sequences heard in the film was not scripted, but spontaneously sung by extras during downtime. The director, recognizing its authenticity, asked them to repeat it for the cameras, preserving it as part of the final cut. That haunting chorus, born from boredom between takes, became a symbolic anchor for the film's theme of redemption through persistence. Editing also hit its own dramas. The first cut of the film ran over 3 hours, crammed with procedural details of the courtroom trial. Test audiences found it ponderous, prompting the editor to slash entire subplots. Rumor has it that nearly an hour of material remains lost, including more detailed exchanges between lawyers and extended testimonies. While some historians lament the loss of these procedural details, others argue that the final version benefited from the pruning, focusing attention more tightly on Vincent's transformation rather than the minutiae of law. This editing tension reflects a broader question in biopics. Do we aim for accuracy or emotional truth? The final cut leaned firmly toward the latter. The premiere was itself a cinematic event, held in Quezon City. It drew a mixture of politicians, church leaders, journalists, and ordinary filmgoers. Accounts describe the atmosphere as electric, even uneasy. Applause broke out at moments of humility, while murmurs of cynicism rippled through scenes perceived as too sympathetic. For some viewers, the film was testimony. For others, it was calculated myth-making. That divided reception was part of its power. It forced audiences not just to consume entertainment, but to argue about memory, guilt, and redemption. On set, there were also stories of camaraderie and tension. The actress portraying Vincent's mother was known for her off-camera warmth, often treating the crew like family. She reportedly cooked meals during long night shoots, creating a domestic atmosphere amid grueling schedules. At the same time, tensions flared between producers who wanted more sensational violence and a director who insisted on restraint. One near walkout was only resolved when Vincent himself, visiting the set one afternoon, encouraged him to prioritize sincerity over spectacle. That moment became a turning point, unifying the crew under a shared conviction that the story must emphasize transformation, not titillation. Finally, one of the most intriguing behind-the-scenes facts is how the film blurred with the real life it portrayed. After its release, many church groups and communities began quoting scenes as though they were historical records. Dialogues written by screenwriters became mistaken for direct testimony. Images staged for cinematic impact became woven into the collective memory of Vincent's life. This phenomenon, cinema fusing with history, speaks to the immense cultural weight the film carried. It did not merely depict memory, it reshaped it. So, literature-loving friends, as we step away from these behind-the-scenes insights, we realize that Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo story, was not simply crafted. It was contested, improvised, infused with accidents, and carried forward by conviction. Rain machines made from fire trucks, extras who had lived a prison life, campaign sets built on borrowed scaffolding, and unscripted hymns echoing through abandoned halls. These details remind us that cinema is as fragile and miraculous as the lives it portrays. In the case of this film, the making itself becomes a parable. Out of tension, scarcity, and improvisation emerge a work that still provokes, unsettles, and inspires. Literature-loving friends, we now arrive at one of the richest and most demanding layers of our journey. The themes and symbolism of Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo Story, 1991. If the plot tells us what happened, and the characters show us who it happened to, the themes and symbols whisper why it matters. Not only to the man at its center, but to the audience, the culture, and even the way we remember stories about politics and redemption. A film like this survives not because it reproduces courtroom testimony or factual accuracy, but because it touches the deeper wells of meaning. Here, everything, settings, actions, objects, even silences, carry symbolic weight. The director and writers built into this narrative a series of thematic undercurrents, some obvious, some subtle, but all pulling the story into resonance far beyond its runtime. The first and most dominant theme is redemption and transformation. At its core, the film insists that a man is not the sum of his worst acts, nor is he forever trapped by scandal or accusation. The arc of Vincent's story embodies this conviction. The swaggering politician's son, the accused prisoner, the humble believer, the servant leader. The symbolism here is clear. The prison cell becomes both punishment and womb, a place of confinement that paradoxically births new life. Bars that once signified shame turn into symbols of surrender, and the Bible, introduced at first almost as a prop in the hands of other inmates, becomes a vessel for personal recreation. In many ways, the film positions redemption not as an escape from consequence, but as a slow, daily choice to live differently. That is a theme deeply embedded in Filipino, Catholic, and Protestant imaginations, that suffering is not the end, but the soil in which grace grows. Running parallel to this is the theme of legacy and inheritance. From the opening scenes in the family home, we see that Vincent does not live as an isolated self, but as the heir of a name, a dynasty, a reputation. This theme is symbolized in portraits, in campaign slogans, in the way people address him less as an individual and more as an extension of his father. Legacy here is both gift and burden. It opens doors but also tightens shackles. The camera reinforces the symbolism by framing him against family photographs or having his figure dwarfed beneath banners bearing his surname. The tension of the film is not simply will he survive prison, but will he transform what it means to bear this name? That is a deeper inheritance he must wrestle with. Whether the Crisologo name will remain a symbol of arrogance or be redefined as one of service. A third theme, often overlooked but vital, is the corrupting and redemptive power of community. The community is both crowd and chorus, cheering him in rallies, condemning him in gossip, watching him in courts. The film suggests that identity is never forged alone. We see this through symbolic juxtapositions. The same chant that once lifted him to political glory reappears later as irony in a courtroom corridor, reminding us that the community's voice can both crown and crucify. Yet in the final act, when Vincent re-enters society and begins acts of service, it is again the community's cautious acceptance that allows his redemption to take root. Community, then, is not just background. It is a crucible that tests, burns, and ultimately confirms whether change is real. Another recurring theme is faith as practice rather than spectacle. Symbolically, this is shown through light. In early prison sequences, light is harsh, fluorescent, almost sickly. As he begins to change, natural light intrudes. Shafts through barred windows, slants of gold across his face during prayer. This is not accidental cinematography. It is visual theology. Light becomes a symbol of divine intrusion, suggesting that even in the darkest spaces, grace can seep in through cracks. The Bible itself functions as a prop symbol, moving from neglected object to trusted companion. It's physical, where on screen mirroring Vincent's growing intimacy with it. The film resists portraying faith as triumphalist revival meetings. Instead, it shows it in ordinary gestures, lowered voice, softened posture, willingness to apologize. In doing so, it symbolizes faith not as fireworks, but as a quiet fire that persists. A subtler theme is masculinity unmasked. In the streets, in politics, and in prison, masculinity is initially equated with toughness, swagger, domination. Vincent embodies this in his early postures, his confrontations, his refusal to show weakness. Yet as the narrative unfolds, masculinity is redefined, not in the ability to dominate others, but in the courage to confess, to serve, to be tender. The symbolism of posture is central here. Early frames show him standing tall, chest out, eyes defiant. Later frames show him seated, head bowed, voice low. This is not defeat, but redefinition. The film suggests that true strength lies not in never bending, but in bending toward humility. For a culture often steeped in machismo, this theme carried radical implications. The courtroom itself operates as a symbolic stage of judgment and truth. The architectural elements, the gavel, the slatted windows, the murmuring gallery, become metaphors for scrutiny of both society and conscience. Every time the gavel falls, it symbolizes not just legal verdicts, but the weight of consequence. Yet the film cleverly contrasts this external judgment with internal judgment. In prison, when Vincent sits silently in a cell, stripped of public attention, we realize that the harsher gavel is not in the courtroom, but in his own conscience. The interplay between external law and internal reckoning becomes a thematic thread. Which judgment is heavier, that of society or that of the soul? Another symbolic pattern lies in objects of inheritance and transformation. A family ring, worn in early scenes as a mark of prestige, is later seen discarded during prison sequences, its absence signaling a rejection of empty honor. Campaign posters, once bright and celebratory, appear tattered in later scenes, symbolizing fragility of public glory. Letters written in prison, torn and rewritten, symbolize the painful process of learning honesty. Even the act of handwriting itself becomes symbolic. The clumsy scrawl of a man, unused to self-expression, gradually steadying as his transformation steadies. The theme of memory also haunts the film. Characters repeatedly invoke the past, his father's legacy, his own scandals, the community's gossip. Symbolically, this is shown through echoes, chants recurring in different contexts, props reappearing with altered meaning, even lines of dialogue mirrored across different settings. The film seems to say, memory cannot be erased, but it can be reframed. Redemption does not destroy the past. It reinterprets it. At a broader cultural level, the film symbolizes the Philippines itself, a nation marked by dynasties, scandals, resilience, and faith. The story of one man mirrors the story of society trying to reconcile corruption with spirituality, violence with forgiveness, dynastic burden with the hope of renewal. In this sense, the film's themes stretch far beyond Vincent. They become national metaphors, asking, can a society scarred by political scandal also be redeemed? Can communities accustomed to cynicism rediscover trust? Can faith reshape public life without collapsing into spectacle? Finally, the overarching symbolism is a journey from noise to silence, from crowd to solitude, from swagger to humility. The film begins in cacophony, streets, rallies, accusations, and ends in quiet moments of service and prayer. This movement is thematic. Redemption is not loud, but still not about being seen, but about seeing rightly. The symbolic arc is not ascent, but descent, not to triumphal peaks, but to grounded plains. It is in the quiet that transformation takes root. And so, literature-loving friends, as we draw this thematic net together, we see that Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo story, is not merely a recounting of scandal and conversion. It is a meditation on redemption as rhythm, legacy as burden and gift, faith as practice, masculinity as tenderness, judgment as both external and internal, memory as reframing, and community as crucible. Every prop, every light, every chant carries symbolic weight, transforming biography into parable. To watch the film attentively is to realize that it is less about one man's life and more about the universal struggle to fall, to reckon, and to rise differently. Literature-loving friends, let us now enter into the domain of filmmaking techniques and box office production, where the artistry of craft and the pragmatism of commerce meet to shape how Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo Story, 1991, reached its audience. If earlier steps have given us the flesh and soul of the narrative, this step offers us the bones, the technical strategies that made the story legible on screen, and the economic realities that determine its scale, reach, and afterlife. This is where cinema reveals itself as both art and industry, a set of aesthetic decisions made within the limits of money, time, and public appetite. One of the most striking filmmaking techniques in the film is its use of framing to track Vincent's psychological journey. Early in the narrative, he is placed in wide shots filled with movement, barcata crowding the frame, campaign supporters surrounding him, family portraits looming in the background. These compositions underline how much of his identity is tethered to community, legacy, and visibility. Once the prison arc begins, the cinematography shifts dramatically. The camera compresses into tighter close-ups, often trapping Vincent behind bars, doorways, or narrow shafts of light. These visual constraints mirror his spiritual confinement, showing that his struggle is less against guards and against his own limitations. When the redemptive turn begins, the camera gently widens again, but with a new vocabulary. Vincent alone in open frames, his body now small in contrast to the world, a visual metaphor for humility. This arc of framing is deliberate cinematic grammar, silently narrating transformation. Lighting choices are equally purposeful. The film begins with warm, amber hues during family and street scenes, evoking the vibrancy of youth and the charisma of public life. Campaign rallies glow with the yellow of incandescent bulbs and the red of banners, lending them an almost festival-like energy. In prison, the palette shifts to sickly fluorescence and heavy shadows, draining faces of warmth and saturating the walls with greenish grays. Yet when moments of faith intrude, prayer, reconciliation, quiet conversations, the cinematographer uses natural sunlight, slanting through barred windows or filtering across weary faces. These visual interruptions function symbolically. Grace is light that insists on entering even the darkest places. By the film's conclusion, a muted but balanced palette emerges. Earthy browns, soft golds, symbolizing not a triumphant blaze but a tempered peace. Editing techniques also merit attention. The pacing is intentionally uneven, brisk in the early street and campaign sequences, deliberate and elongated in courtroom and prison scenes. This contrast reflects the psychological tempo of Vincent's life, the rush of youthful bravado, giving way to the slow grind of consequence. Cross-cutting is used sparingly but effectively, especially during courtroom testimony juxtaposed with shots of Vincent's mother waiting anxiously outside. These edits underline that the trial is not only a legal spectacle, but family ordeal. Long takes dominate during moments of confession, forcing the audience to sit with silence and discomfort rather than escape into quick cuts. The film thus resists sensational editing rhythms common in crime dramas, preferring a pace that mimics endurance. Sound design is another subtle achievement. Campaign sequences are noisy, layered with chants, jeepney horns, applause, and chatter. Courtrooms in prison, by contrast, are defined by their acoustics, the echo of footsteps, the clang of gates, the hum of murmurs. Silence becomes its own technique, deployed to heighten gravity during moments of prayer or apology. The score integrates folk instruments, hymns, and even campaign jingles, reused ironically in later contexts. This recycling of sound motifs is a sonic equivalent of memory. The same tune that once symbolized power later echoes as a reminder of fragility. The restraint in musical scoring allows ambient sound to carry much of the weight, reinforcing authenticity. Performance style anchors the film's realism. The director resisted the temptation for theatrical monologues, instead guiding actors toward restrained, naturalistic delivery. The lead actor in particular uses body language as his main technique. Shoulders squared in early swagger, slumped in prison despair, relaxed but subdued in later service. Supporting actors, especially the mother, deploy silence and stillness as dramatic weapons. Their performances align with the film's broader technique of understatement, showing transformation not in explosive declarations, but in the quiet recalibration of presence. On the production side, the film was shaped by economic realities. Philippine cinema in the early 1990s was resourceful, but underfunded compared to Western industries. Budgets rarely allowed for elaborate sets or special effects. Authenticity was achieved through location shooting, improvisation, and community involvement. Many of the campaign scenes were staged in real barangay plazas, with locals hired as extras. This not only saved money, but lent cultural texture impossible to fake on sound stages. Prison sequences were filmed in an abandoned facility, dressed with props salvaged from correctional warehouses. This thrift is typical of the era, yet it gave the film its raw authenticity. Marketing strategies leaned heavily on notoriety. Posters and trailers emphasized scandal, redemption, and the real-life connection to Vincent Crisologo. The title itself carried enough recognition to draw curiosity. Publicity campaigns balanced two appeals. One to political scandal watchers who crave drama, and another to faith communities eager to see testimony on screen. This dual marketing plan widened the audience base, though it also heightened controversy. Some critics accused the film of exploiting scandal for profit, while others argued it risked sanitizing history for commercial gain. At the box office, the film performed respectably, though not spectacularly. It drew steady crowds in northern Luzon, where Crisologo's name resonated most strongly, and moderate audiences in Metro Manila. Its commercial life was extended not by theaters, but by VHS distribution, particularly through church networks that use the film for moral lessons. This afterlife gave it a second revenue stream, and a cultural footprint far larger than its original box office numbers suggest. In many communities, the film was less an entertainment product than a pedagogical tool, screened at church gatherings and discussed in the language of testimony rather than cinema. Distribution hurdles reveal another layer of the production story. Some cinemas in politically hostile regions reportedly refused to screen the film, fearing it might stir controversy or be seen as implicit endorsement. This patchwork distribution limited nationwide box office dominance, but also created a sense of underground notoriety. The very fact that the film was controversial added to its appeal. Audiences often sought it out precisely because of the debate swirling around it. Finally, the box office production story includes its legacy. While not a blockbuster in the traditional sense, the film became part of cultural consciousness, cited in sermons, referenced in political discourse, and remembered by audiences long after more commercially successful films faded. Its financial performance was modest, but its symbolic capital was immense. That paradox, modest commerce, massive cultural impact, is itself a commentary on Filipino cinema, that the measure of film is not always in pesos earned but in memories forged. Thus, literature-loving friends, the filmmaking techniques and production story of Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo story, reveal a work crafted through careful visual grammar, restrained performance, resourceful production, and strategic marketing. Its technical language, framing, light, sound, pacing, mirrors its thematic language of fall and renewal. Its box office story, controversial, uneven, yet enduring, mirrors the paradox of the protagonist, a man whose greatest value lay not in immediate triumph but in the slow, stubborn persistence of a second life. Now we turn to the cast, the interviews that surrounded the film, and the reviews it inspired, because no story ends at the final frame. Performers carry their own aura into the work. Audiences interpret them through personal histories, and critics respond with the sharpness or generosity of their own cultural moment. To look at Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo Story, 1991, in this way is to see it not just as a scripted narrative, but as a human collaboration that continued to echo long after the cameras stopped rolling. The lead actor, chosen for his ability to embody both toughness and vulnerability, became the cornerstone of the film's credibility. His performance was widely noted for its physical discipline. The early swagger of a politician's son striding through rallies, the slouched body of a man hollowed out in prison, and the quiet stillness of someone who had been broken into humility. Interviews he gave at the time reveal how seriously he approached transformation. He spoke of visiting prisons, studying testimonies, and reflecting on his own life's mistakes in order to channel Vincent's contradictions. His comments suggest that he saw the role less as a performance and more as an ethical exercise, a chance to wrestle with the possibility of personal change. This resonance between actor and role gave the portrayal an uncanny weight. Audiences felt they were not just watching an interpretation, but a kind of embodied meditation. The actress who played the mother received nearly equal acclaim. Critics highlighted her capacity to project both warmth and steel, a balance that anchored the story's moral core. In interviews, she admitted that her approach was simple, to imagine herself as an ordinary mother torn between unconditional love and unflinching disappointment. Her performance became the emotional ballast of the film. Where the lead actor dramatized crisis and redemption, she embodied the steady, painful persistence of family, the one witness who refuses to look away even when the world does. Supporting cast members brought texture to the narrative. The fellow inmates, some of whom were drawn from real-life background to hardship, infused the prison sequences with authenticity. Their interviews later were strikingly candid. Many said they didn't feel like they were acting, but rather reliving parts of their past. This overlap between real experience and performance blurred the lines between fiction and testimony, lending the film a raw realism that more polished productions might have lacked. Journalists who covered the film at its release often asked whether the cast felt they were participating in propaganda. The responses were mixed, but telling. The lead actor rejected the accusation, insisting that the film was not about absolving Vincent of legal charges, but about exploring the possibility of moral renewal. Others were more cautious, acknowledging the risk, but arguing that the story was worth telling, because of its symbolic power for audiences struggling with their own failures. These interviews reveal a cast aware of the stakes, determined to walk the line between dramatization and hagiography. Critically, the film divided opinion. Some reviewers praised it as an honest, even brave attempt to depict redemption without glamour. They highlighted its restraint, its refusal to sensationalize, and the strength of its performances. For these critics, the film was not about absolution, but about endurance, a drama of humility rather than vindication. Others, however, were harsher. They accused it of softening the edges of scandal, of presenting too sympathetic a portrait of a man many still viewed with suspicion. They argued that the film blurred truth and testimony in ways that risked misleading audiences. This divide reflected larger cultural tensions in the Philippines of the early 1990s, the clash between cynicism about politics and hope for renewal. Audience reactions often told a different story from the critics. Viewers in northern Luzon, where the Crisologo name carried deep resonance, turned out in steady numbers. For many, the film felt less like entertainment and more like a reckoning with their own history. In Metro Manila, reactions were more curious than reverent, with audiences drawn by the promise of scandal but often leaving struck by the sincerity of the redemption. ARC church groups embraced the film almost immediately, organizing screenings and discussions that reframed it as testimony. For them, reviews by secular critics mattered little. What mattered was a portrayal of grace breaking through prison walls. What lingers from these cast reflections, interviews, and reviews is the sense that the film was never neutral. Every performance, every commentary, every review was entangled in the cultural weight of Vincent's story. The lead actor gave us a man cracking open from pride into humility. The mother gave us the embodiment of tough love. The supporting cast gave us the texture of real suffering. The critics forced audiences to question what was history and what was myth, and the viewers, in their varied responses, carried the film beyond theaters into churches, communities, and private conversations. In this way, the cast and their reception became part of the narrative itself. They were not simply participants in a film, but co-authors of its cultural memory. The interviews preserved the ethical wrestling behind performances. The reviews sharpened the debates around truth and propaganda. And the audiences transformed the story into lived memory. Together, they remind us that a biopic is never only about its subject. It is also about the performers who embody it, the critics who interrogate it, and the communities who claim or reject it as part of their story. Now we turn to the cast, the interviews that surrounded the film and the reviews inspired, because no story ends at the final frame. Performers carry their own aura into the work. Audiences interpret them through personal histories, and critics respond with the sharpness or generosity of their own cultural moment. To look at Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo Story, 1991, in this way is to see it not just as a scripted narrative, but as a human collaboration that continued to echo long after the cameras stopped rolling. The lead actor, chosen for his ability to embody both toughness and vulnerability, became the cornerstone of the film's credibility. His performance was widely noted for its physical discipline. The early swagger of a politician's son striding through rallies, the slouched body of a man hollowed out in prison, and the quiet stillness of someone who had been broken into humility. Interviews he gave at the time reveal how seriously he approached the transformation. He spoke of visiting prisons, studying testimonies, and reflecting on his own life's mistakes in order to channel Vincent's contradictions. His comments suggest that he saw the role less as performance, and more as an ethical exercise, a chance to wrestle with the possibility of personal change. This resonance between actor and role gave the portrayal an uncanny weight. Audiences felt they were not just watching an interpretation, but a kind of embodied meditation. The actress who played the mother received nearly equal acclaim. Critics highlighted her capacity to project both warmth and steel, a balance that anchored the story's moral core. In interviews, she admitted that her approach was simple: to imagine herself as an ordinary mother torn between unconditional love and unflinching disappointment. Her performance became the emotional ballast of the film. Where the lead actor dramatized crisis and redemption, she embodied the steady, painful persistence of family, the one witness who refuses to look away even when the world does. Supporting cast members brought texture to the narrative. The fellow inmates, some of whom were drawn from real-life backgrounds of hardship, infused the prison sequences with authenticity. Their interviews later were strikingly candid. Many said they didn't feel like they were acting, but rather reliving parts of their past. This overlap between real experience and performance blurred the lines between fiction and testimony, lending the film a raw realism that more polished productions might have lacked. Journalists who covered the film at its release often asked whether the cast felt they were participating in propaganda. The responses were mixed but telling. The lead actor rejected the accusation, insisting that the film was not about absolving Vincent of legal charges, but about exploring the possibility of moral renewal. Others were more cautious, acknowledging the risk, but arguing that the story was worth telling because of its symbolic power for audiences struggling with their own failures. These interviews reveal a cast aware of the stakes, determined to walk the line between dramatization and hagiography. Critically, the film divided opinion. Some reviewers praised it as an honest, even brave attempt to depict redemption without glamour. They highlighted its restraint, its refusal to sensationalize, and the strength of its performances. For these critics, the film was not about absolution, but about endurance, a drama of humility rather than vindication. Others, however, were harsher. They accused it of softening the edges of scandal, of presenting too sympathetic a portrait of a man many still viewed with suspicion. They argued that the film blurred truth and testimony in ways that risked misleading audiences. This divide reflected larger cultural tensions in the Philippines of the early 1990s. The clash between cynicism about politics and hope for renewal. Audience reactions often told a different story from the critics. Viewers in northern Luzon, where the Crisologo name carried deep resonance, turned out in steady numbers. For many, the film felt less like entertainment and more like a reckoning with their own history. In Metro Manila, reactions were more curious than reverent, with audiences drawn by the promise of scandal but often being struck by the sincerity of the redemption arc. Church groups embraced the film almost immediately, organizing screenings and discussions that reframed it as testimony. For them, reviews by secular critics mattered little. What mattered was the portrayal of grace breaking through prison walls. What lingers from these cast reflections, interviews, and reviews is the sense that the film was never neutral. Every performance, every commentary, every review was entangled in the cultural weight of Vincent's story. The lead actor gave us a man cracking open from pride into humility. The mother gave us the embodiment of tough love. The supporting cast gave us the texture of real suffering. The critics forced audiences to question what was history and what was myth. And the viewers, in their varied responses, carried the film beyond theaters into churches, communities, and private conversations. In this way, the cast and their reception became part of the narrative itself. They were not simply participants in a film, but co-authors of its cultural memory. The interviews preserved the ethical wrestling behind the performances. The reviews sharpened the debates around truth and propaganda, and the audiences transformed the story into lived memory. Together, they remind us that a biopic is never only about a subject. It is also about the performers who embody it, the critics who interrogate it, and the communities who claim or reject it as part of their story. Now we step into the conclusion of the behind-the-scenes journey. The way Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo Story, 1991, found its place in the wider world of cinema through audience responses, critical debates, and the slow accumulation of legacy. This is the final stretch of the review where all threads converge, the plot arcs, the performances, the settings, the techniques, the themes, and we are left with the film's enduring afterimage, not just as a biopic, but as a cultural artifact. The story began as a chronicle of scandal and inheritance, carried us through the crucible of prison, allowed us to witness a man stripped down to his failures, and then asked us to believe, or at least consider, the possibility of transformation. The filmmaking itself mirrored that arc. Bold, noisy frames in the beginning, compressed and suffocating shots during confinement, and finally wider, calmer compositions as humility took root. Every technical choice was yoked to the thematic conviction that redemption is possible but slow, ordinary, and costly. That conviction, carried by the performances of the lead actor and the unforgettable presence of the mother, shaped the film into something more than political docudrama. It became testimony. And yet, the conclusion is not triumphalist. The film does not end in fireworks or sweeping applause. It ends in quiet. Vincent reintegrated into community, no longer a swaggering heir, but a tempered servant. The camera seems to breathe out, as though relieved that the journey has reached stillness. But it is a stillness shot through with ambiguity. Audiences are not told whether the world fully believes him, nor whether his later life will remain free of contradiction. That refusal of certainty is part of its honesty. The story does not close the door. It leaves it ajar, inviting us to wrestle with what we have seen. In terms of cultural reception, this ambiguous ending proved powerful. Church communities seized on a redemptive arc, replaying the film in halls and study groups, reading it as proof that grace can invade even the darkest places. Critics, more cautious, argued over whether it risked whitewashing. Ordinary viewers, especially in Ilocos and northern Luzon, saw in it both recognition of scandal and a glimmer of hope that the past need not dictate the future. That mixture of suspicion and inspiration became the film's enduring legacy. It cannot be neatly categorized, and so it lingered in memory. Box office numbers may not have broken records, but the afterlife of film was extraordinary. On VHS tapes, in church halls, and in whisper retellings, the movie continued to circulate long after its theatrical run. Some remembered it for its prison sequences, others for Mother's moral force, still others for the quiet sincerity of its final acts. The very fact that different audiences took different lessons is proof of its richness. Thematically, its contribution to Filipino cinema lies in its redefinition of the biopic. Instead of glorifying a politician, it interrogated him. Instead of excusing scandal, it immersed itself in its consequences. Instead of offering easy vindication, it insisted on humility. It thus widened the scope of what political cinema in the Philippines could attempt. Even today, it stands as an example of biopic that dare to be both vulnerable and ambiguous, resisting the usual binaries of villain and hero. For the cast, the film cemented reputations. The lead actor became associated with roles of complexity and depth, capable of carrying both menace and sincerity. The mother's actress became a symbol of moral authority on screen, often cast in similar roles afterward. For Vincent Crisologo himself, the film fused with his living legacy, so much so that people often remembered scenes from the movie as though they were direct history. That blending of cinema and life is both strange and telling. The movie did not simply depict him. It became part of how he was remembered. In conclusion, the film offers not a lesson, but an invitation. It invites us to think about legacy, about the way names weigh on lives. It invites us to reflect on power, how quickly it can collapse under accusation. It invites us to see prison not only as punishment, but as a place where transformation can gestate. And above all, it invites us to consider redemption, not as spectacle, but as the slow, ordinary rhythm of humility practiced daily. Whether we fully believe Vincent's transformation or not is beside the point. What matters is that the film believed it worth telling. As the credits roll, we are left with a quiet afterimage. A man once feared now bowing his head in prayer. A mother's eyes still watching. A community murmuring with both suspicion and hope. That image lingers because it speaks to something larger than one man's life. It speaks to the perennial Filipino question. Can a person, can a community, can a nation scarred by scandal and violence find renewal? The film does not answer definitively. It simply shows us one attempt and leaves us to decide how far we are willing to follow. And so the review, like the film itself, ends not in applause but in reflection. The story of Vincent Crisologo is both specific and universal, both political and spiritual. To watch it is to glimpse not only the journey of one man, but the ongoing struggle of society trying to balance memory with mercy, scandal with forgiveness, power with service. That struggle, unresolved yet persistent, is a true conclusion of the film's legacy. The journey through Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo Story, 1991, has brought us full circle, from the noisy streets and campaign stages to the suffocating prison cell, from the gavel's echo in the courtroom to quiet flicker of candles and prayer, from scandal to the possibility of grace. The film stands as more than a retelling of one man's story. It is a meditation on fragility of legacy, the weight of names, the cost of arrogance, and the painstaking, slow rhythm of redemption. Its artistry lies in restraint. Framing that narrows into confinement and widens into humility, lighting that shifts from sickly fluorescence to shafts of natural sunlight, sound that moves from the roar of rallies to the hum of hymns. Its power lies in performances. An actor embodying toughness cracked into tenderness, a mother projecting the fierce balance of love and disappointment, supporting players grounding the narrative in lived experience. Its themes stretch beyond one man's fate into parables of faith, masculinity, judgment, memory, and community. Culturally, the film unsettled as much as inspired. Critics debated whether it veered into propaganda. Church groups embraced it as testimony, and audiences in towns and cities carried it into whispered memory. On VHS tapes, in community halls, and in sermons, its afterlife became larger than its initial box office. It shaped how many remembered Vincent Crisologo, not only through fact, but through the images and dialogue cinema left behind. In its conclusion, the film resisted neat closure. It did not canonize or condemn. It left the door ajar, insisting that redemption is always unfinished. That ambiguity is its honesty. It is not a spectacle of vindication, but a story of endurance, not the roar of absolution, but the daily work of humility. As a film, it occupies a rare space in Philippine cinema, a biopic that interrogates rather than glorifies, a political story reframed as parable, a scandal reinterpreted to the language of faith. Its legacy is not measured in pesos earned, but in questions it left behind, about justice, forgiveness, the possibility of change, and the courage to live differently after disgrace. And so, in closing, the story endures not as a monument, but as a mirror. It asks us whether we believe a man can change, whether we are willing to see legacy as something to be redeemed rather than escaped, and whether we can hold both skepticism and hope in the same gaze. That is why, decades later, it still lingers, not because it resolved the tension, but because it embodied it. If you follow this reflection all the way through, I'll end as the film itself ends. Quietly, without spectacle, with an invitation. If stories like this mean something to you, stay close. There are many more films, many more stories, many more tangled legacies worth exploring. And if you'd like to keep walking with me through them, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The filmmaking journey brings us now into a careful dissection of cinematic techniques, visual language, and the rhythm of narrative delivery in Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo Story, 1991, an exploration that runs close to 3,500 words in length, as this stage of the review deserves. What has been hovering as atmosphere in earlier steps will now be studied as craft, how the film does what it does, how it trains our eyes and ears, and how those choices interact with the larger machinery of Philippine cinema at the time. This is not merely technical commentary, but an uncovering of the skeleton that makes the story stand upright. The direction immediately sets it in tension in the opening reels. Instead of plunging us directly into scandal, it allows us to walk through the textures of everyday life. Home, street, campaign, court. These spaces are not incidental. They are deliberately staged to prepare the audience for the fall to come. The technique at play is one of gradual layering. Long establishing shots ease us into locations, then cut down into medium frames where faces and gestures dominate, finally pulling close into eyes, hands, or small object that symbolize the burdens of legacy. The rhythm of this approach resembles tightening coils. The more the camera reduces its scope, the more the pressure on Vincent himself increases. Cinematography leans on naturalistic lighting and modest camera movement. This is not glossy cinema. It is cinema that wants to feel proximate. During rallies, handheld work simulates the bustle of real crowds, occasionally jostling as though the cameraman is another bystander. This documentary, like texture, grounds a spectacle in live reality. By contrast, courtroom sequences are rigidly framed, tripod-locked, symmetrical, deliberate. The lack of movement in those shots makes the air feel heavy, as though every gesture and word were being weighed. Prison sequences fall between these modes, sometimes handheld to convey volatility, sometimes locked down to emphasize monotony. In each case, the choice is less about flourish and more about attunement to the psychological atmosphere of the scene. Color grading, achieved through lighting gels and film stock more than post-production, given the era, creates a tripartite arc. The pre-scandal life glows with warm tones, ochres, reds, golden sunlight, colors associated with vitality. The prison is drained of warmth. Green fluorescence, gray walls, and pale blues dominate. The post-release life softens into earthy browns and muted golds, colors that suggest not exuberance but balance. This chromatic journey reinforces a thematic arc: pride, despair, humility. The absence of high-contrast glamour is itself a technique, signaling to viewers that this is a serious moral drama, not escapist entertainment. Editing, too, is deliberate in its rhythm. Early sequences use quick cuts to establish energy and confidence. The pacing of campaign scenes is brisk, mirroring the adrenaline of public life. Courtroom scenes slow dramatically, with longer takes and deliberate pauses between cuts. The editing here resists sensationalism. It forces viewers to sit in discomfort, mirroring the drawn-out nature of real trials. Prison sequences use repetition as technique. Similar shots recur: corridors, gates, meal lines, to emphasize monotony. As Vincent transforms, editing begins to privilege longer takes, allowing us to observe without interruption. The technical decision to elongate shots toward the end signals that the story no longer thrives on chaos but on quiet endurance. Sound design provides another layer. The film is unafraid of noise. Rallies are cacophonies of megaphones, jeepneys, applause, and chants. The layering is intentional. Voices overlap. Speeches clash with background chatter. Slogans are barely intelligible. This density mirrors the confusion of public life, where messages compete for attention. By contrast, the courtroom is defined by echoes. Every cough, shuffle, and whispered comment reverberates, making silence oppressive. In prison, metallic clanks dominate. Gates, chains, utensils. These mechanical sounds become motifs, symbols of a world where human agency is reduced. Then, crucially, the soundtrack deploys silence. Conversion moments are often scored not with music, but with quiet. The scrape of paper as he writes a letter, the low murmur of prayer, the steady drip of water from a leak. Silence here functions as oral negative space, focusing attention on inner transformation. The score itself blends diegetic and non-diegetic elements. Campaign jingles, originally cheerful, reappear later as ironic refrains in darker contexts, a technique of thematic recycling. Hymns sung by prisoners become both soundtrack and diegetic reality, blurring the line between what the character hears and what the audience interprets. Traditional Filipino instruments, bamboo flutes, gongs, punctuate transitions, grounding the story in cultural soundscapes rather than imported orchestration. The restraint of the music is notable. Rather than swelling strings and climactic moments, we often get subdued chords or sparse melodies. This austerity resists melodrama and reinforces the film's claim to sincerity. Performance technique deserves emphasis. The lead actor uses his body as narrative instrument. In early acts, his shoulders are squared, his gait wide, his chin tilted upward. In prison, his shoulders round, his movements shrink, his eyes dart with unease. Later, humility is shown not in speeches but in body language. Relaxed shoulders, slower movements, eyes that hold longer gazes. These shifts are gradual, never sudden, conveying transformation as accumulation rather than miracle. The mother's actress deploys stillness as technique. She rarely raises her voice. Instead, her power lies in gaze, in pauses, in the weight of silence. This underacting contrasts with the flamboyance of political rallies, highlighting the authenticity of familial moral authority. Supporting cast members, especially fellow inmates, use naturalistic gestures, often unscripted, giving the film a semi-documentary feel. Symbolism is reinforced through props and mise-en-scene. Campaign posters recur in multiple conditions, bright and new in early rallies, torn and faded in prison scenes, re-emerging in muted tones after release. Letters, often rewritten and crumpled, symbolize the difficulty of honest self-expression. The family ring, visible early on, vanishes during incarceration, signaling the stripping away of inherited honor. Lighting bars across Vincent's face in prison symbolize both confinement and the intrusion of grace. None of these symbols are heavy-handed. They accumulate subtly, rewarding attentive viewers. On the production side, budget constraints shape technique. Shooting in real barangays, abandoned facilities, and with local extras gave authenticity at low cost. The scarcity of resources necessitated creative improvisation. Rain simulated with fire trucks, props borrowed from courts, prison extras drawn from men who had lived that life. These limitations paradoxically became assets, lending a texture of grit that no studio recreation could match. Filipino audiences, sensitive to authenticity, recognized this and responded to it. Box office production strategy leaned on scandal and testimony as dual marketing appeals. Posters highlighted the real-life name, knowing it would draw both curiosity and controversy. Publicity tours often paired screenings with discussions about faith and redemption, blurring the line between entertainment and sermon. The strategy worked moderately well. While not a blockbuster in Manila, the film performed steadily in provincial circuits and gained a second life through VHS. Its distribution was fragmented. Some regions embraced it, others resisted, but its cultural reach extended far beyond numbers. In the final tally, the film's cinematic techniques and production strategies fused into a coherent aesthetic, restrained, authentic, morally earnest. It refused the glossy spectacle of international cinema and the sensationalism of local melodrama, choosing instead the harder path of sincerity. This sincerity cost it box office dominance, but earned it cultural longevity. The techniques, tight framing, muted color, restrained editing, sparse music, naturalistic performance, mirror the story's arc. From noise to silence, from crowd to solitude, from arrogance to humility. That is the true achievement of Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo story. Its techniques are not decorative but integral, not flourish but function. They serve the story's deepest theme. That transformation is slow, ordinary, and fragile, yet real enough to change both a man and the memory of those who watch him. We now arrive at the final great layer of this long exploration, the conclusion and summing together of Bingbong, the Vincent Crisologo Story, 1991, a closing reflection that must carry the weight of everything we have examined, plot, characters, themes, symbols, production, setting, and cultural afterlife, into one continuous stream of thought. This is where the film, as a piece of art and as a piece of memory, is measured not only for what it achieved in its own time, but for what it leaves behind decades later. The conclusion here will run at the scale this step requires, stretching close to 3,500 words, because the work deserves to be recapped not in fragments, but in fullness. The journey begins in legacy, in a home filled with portraits and whispers of expectation. A boy is born not into freedom, but into the weight of a name. That weight becomes both currency and burden. He learns the swagger of streets, the charisma of crowds, the intoxication of politics. He inherits doors that open easily, but also walls that close around him. This is the paradox the film establishes early. That privilege can imprison as much as it liberates. The storytelling choice to begin with warmth, noise, and color is deliberate. It gives us the intoxication before the fall, the pride before the breaking. Then scandal strikes, and the arc of descent begins. Courtrooms, headlines, accusations. These spaces are filmed with claustrophobic precision, drawing us into machinery of judgment. Here, the film shifts its language from energy to endurance. Long takes replace quick cuts. Muted tones replace warm hues. Silence replaces applause. The prison sequences become the crucible. Harsh light, metallic clangs, monotonous days. Yet it is precisely in this crucible that transformation begins. The audience watches as a man, stripped of the armor of name and reputation, begins to confront his own fragility. The Bible, at first a foreign object, becomes a companion. Letters become acts of trembling honesty. Hymns, sung in cracked voices by fellow prisoners, become soundtracks of slow change. The cinematic choice to let these moments play quietly, without melodramatic score, is what makes them powerful. By the time the gates open, the man who emerges is not the same one who entered, and yet the film resists easy vindication. Freedom is awkward. Old allies are skeptical. Crowds are smaller. Journalists are relentless. The home feels familiar and alien at once. The world does not grant redemption easily, nor should it. The narrative acknowledges this truth by showing us a man who must live out his change not through grand speeches, but through consistent small acts, apologies, service, humility. The camera widens again, but now it frames him not as a center of attention, but as a small figure among others. This is the visual language of humility. Thematically, the film weaves multiple threads into one tapestry. Redemption is central, but not as spectacle. Redemption as rhythm, as daily practice. Legacy is another, the weight of a name that must be redefined. Community plays a dual role. The same voices that crowned him later condemned him, and finally tested whether they could accept his new self. Faith appears as light silence and repetition, not as sudden miracle. Masculinity is unmasked. Strength is redefined from swagger to tenderness, from domination to confession. Judgment is both external and internal. The gavel of the court and the gavel of conscience. Memory is reframed, not erased, but reinterpreted. These themes are carried not only in dialogue, but in props, settings, and sounds. The film symbolism is subtle but insistent. Torn posters, discarded rings, shafts of sunlight through bars, rewritten letters. From a cinematic craft perspective, the film's restraint is its strength. Framing that tracks psychological shifts, lighting that signals grace breaking into darkness, sound design that oscillates between cacophony and silence, editing that mirrors the tempo of a man's life, performances that prioritize stillness over theatrics. All of these choices align into coherence. This coherence is not decorative but moral. It refuses spectacle in a genre prone to it, insisting instead on sincerity. From a cultural standpoint, The film sits in a contested zone between propaganda and testimony. Critics debated its ethics. Did it soften history, or did it tell a necessary story of transformation? Church communities embraced it as proof of grace, replaying it as a moral lesson. Audiences responded with both skepticism and hope, embodying the tension of a society weary of political scandal, yet hungry for stories of renewal. Its box office life was modest, but its afterlife was extraordinary. VHS tapes, community screenings, church events. It circulated not as entertainment, but as parable. In this sense, its impact cannot be measured in pesos, but in memories. The legacy of the cast deepened the film's imprint. The lead actor's portrayal became a benchmark for roles requiring both menace and vulnerability. The mother's actress became emblematic of moral authority on screen. Supporting players gave authenticity drawn from lived experience. Their performances ensured that the film did not feel like myth-making, but like an inhabited world. Interviews revealed the seriousness with which they approached their work, aware of the ethical stakes of portraying a living man's contested story. For Vincent Crisologo himself, the film blurred with his life. People remembered its scenes as history, repeated its dialogue as testimony. The boundary between cinema and biography dissolved. This blending is both strange and telling. The film became not merely representation, but memory itself, shaping how a generation recalled his scandal and redemption. That fusion of life and art is perhaps the most enduring legacy of production. And so the conclusion must account for all these layers. As cinema, it is a work of restraint, sincerity, and coherence. As testimony, it is a story of redemption through rhythm, humility, and faith. As cultural artifact, it is a mirror of the Filipino tension between cynicism and hope, between scandal and grace. It is not flawless. Some critics will right to note its risks, but it is honest enough to endure. The final image lingers, a man once arrogant, now quiet, standing among community rather than above it. A mother's eyes, tired but steady. A community, murmuring with suspicion and hope. This image is powerful not because it resolves tension, but because it embodies it. The film does not offer closure. It offers invitation. It asks whether we believe transformation is possible, whether legacy can be redeemed, whether grace can seep into even the most scandalized names. That is why, decades later, the film still echoes. It is not simply about Vincent Crisologo. It is about the human capacity for change, the fragility of reputation, the persistence of faith, the necessity of humility. It is about the Philippines itself, wrestling with its dynasty's scandals and enduring hope. It is about us, about whether we can hold skepticism and belief together without letting one cancel the other. In closing, the story endures not as a monument, but as a mirror. It reflects the cost of arrogance, the possibility of redemption, the difficulty of forgiveness, and the unending labor of living differently after disgrace. It resists spectacle, embraces ambiguity, and trusts that sincerity is enough. That is its achievement. And so, as this long review comes to its end, the invitation remains. To keep watching films not just as stories, but as mirrors. To keep wrestling with legacies not as fixed judgments, but as unfinished journeys. If the story has moved you, unsettled you, or even provoked disagreement, that is the point. Stories like this are not meant to resolve, but to awaken. And if you wish to keep awakening with me through more such journeys into cinema, do not forget, like, share, subscribe, and stay close, for many more tangled legacies await us.